Hi everyone. In this lecture I want to talk a little bit about Venetian painting and primarily focusing on 16th century Venetian painting. This is a very, very important development in the history of Western art, a kind of alternative, as it were, to the Florentine priority on disegno and the influence of Leonardo, Raphael, and Michelangelo. So Venice is a very different art center with very different priorities from those of Florence or of Rome. We're going to focus primarily on the use of oil paint in Venice, the focus on color and the appeal to the senses, the concept of colorito. We'll look a little bit at the idea of the pastoral in art and wrap up with a discussion of the contributions of Titian, particularly as he anticipates some stylistic trends that will really become manifest in the Baroque. So let's begin with a view here of Giovanni Bellini's really remarkable Sacra Conversazione type of altarpiece in San Zaccaria, a church very, very close to the Piazza San Marco in the heart of Venice. This altarpiece, which is dated 1505, is at the end of, near the end I should say, of Giovanni Bellini's very long life. He dies in 1516, probably in his late 80s, and really marks the culmination of a career of studying the effects of color and light, and really sets apart, I think, the Venetian painting tradition from the contributions of centers such as Florence and Rome. So let's begin looking at that altarpiece in a little bit more detail. The altarpiece, as I've already mentioned, is of a Sacra Conversazione type, which is very, very popular from, say, the middle of the 15th century on until about really maybe the first decade or so of the 16th century. It begins to be replaced, as we'll see with the work of Titian, by a more dynamic vision of painting. But in Venice it really reaches a kind of a peak of perfection, as it were, especially in this painting by Giovanni Bellini. Sacra Conversazione is a concept in Italian art, I guess would be the best way of talking about it, where a group of saints who may be very distant in time or place are gathered together around a sacred person or object or what have you, and are simply meditating. And so there's no real narrative or action of any kind. Instead, the focus is more on a contemplative or meditative sort of emotional climate. And really much of the impact of the painting is going to be implied rather than directly stated, and to a certain degree relies, especially in Venetian art, on the role of color. So as we zoom in just a little bit on the picture, we can begin to see this in perhaps better detail as we go in just a little bit more. You can see the degree to which Giovanni Bellini has very, very carefully reproduced and to a certain degree I think enhanced the effects of light, and even soft light falling across the characters, their garments, and of course the architectural setting, this wonderful apse that we see here. Let me actually see if I can pull out just a little bit so you can kind of see where that's coming from. So you can see that the figures are in a semicircular niche here that is covered by a half dome here with mosaic decoration. Again, a very typical Venetian art form. So the sense of light is very, very strong. And also, as I've mentioned before, there's a very strong sense of color. So let's go look just a little bit more closely at that. For instance, in very rich blues and reds and greens of the garments of, well, we'll take St. Catherine, for instance, here, or the blues of the Virgin Mary's robe, or even these wonderful yellows and oranges. These are made possible through Venetian proximity to trading routes. In fact, Venice itself is a great commercial center. The proximity to sources of these pigments, especially, for instance, rich blues, which are coming from places like Afghanistan, for instance. We see a lot less blue, for instance, the further west we move in Europe. It's very, very expensive. There's also what I guess I would describe as a Venetian predilection for developing the possibilities of color. And color can come both in terms of hue but also in terms of effects of light and shade. And I think that Giovanni Bellini is working in both ways. That is to say, we have rich saturated colors like we might see in the blue area here, the Virgin's robe, but we also see an interesting interplay between light and shade that seems to suffice in its own right as an object of contemplation. The other thing that's happening in here that sort of feeds into this as well is the sense of an absence of dependence on line, I guess is the best way of thinking of it right now. That is to say, form is defined not through linear strategies like we might expect to see in Botticelli, but instead works very much in a Leonard-esque, I suppose, sort of way, almost like sfumato. The emphasis is developing the figures, for instance, their three-dimensional mass, primarily through the use of light and shade, instead of drawing lines to delineate the sort of outer circumference, for instance, of Saint Jerome. And the closer that we go into someone, if we look, for instance, at Saint Jerome, we would see, let me just look in a little bit closer, the degree to which Giovanni Bellini has created form entirely out of tone, that is to say, moving from light to dark. So the overall mood is one of great sort of stillness, a quiet contemplation of the mystery, really, of the incarnation of Christ. It's a very moving and profound piece, and indicative, again, of the artist's powers, even so late in his life. And that, by the way, is also present, interestingly enough, in a very different type of painting, which is the Feast of the Gods by Giovanni Bellini. And this is a striking picture in many, many ways. It's really roughly contemporary with the San Zaccaria altarpiece. It's finished later. The date traditionally given ranges between about 1510 and 1530 between Giovanni Bellini and his younger successor Titian working on this. As we look at the painting, it's important to remember that basically the lower band of figures and a small portion of the trees up above is the work of Giovanni Bellini, and then most of the landscape in the upper left sort of quarter of the picture is that of Titian. And this would have been updated by Titian at the request, I think, of Alfonso d'Este to kind of bring this altarpiece more in line with other contributions by Titian, one of which we'll see shortly. Again, the first impression is one of rich, saturated color. We can see this most strikingly, of course, again, in the garments of the participants in the scene. Again, a pagan mythological scene, probably taken from Ovid, and other sources are mixed into this, but the Roman poet Ovid describing a certain festival or feast that happens is from his book called the Fasti, essentially the parties, the celebrations. And so there's this banquet of the gods, and the gods are resplendent in all kinds of richly hued garments of one kind or another. You can see some very subtle coloristic tricks, for instance, in this. If we look at Mercury's robe here, you can see a beautiful kind of contrast between blues and reds. Again, a kind of multicolored effect. Again, rich blues, greens, reds. These are very expensive and difficult to work with pigments, and of course would be reserved really for a very aristocratic patron. As we move across the scene, we can see Giovanni Bellini's talent for creating form with light and shade, and also at the same time his restraint in depicting his figures here as they're drinking and having a great time. They're remarkably sober and still. The eroticism of this vignette here on the right, which forms part of the major theme of the pictures, is strikingly restrained and limited. But nevertheless, again, for a very, very old man at this point in time, it's a remarkable illustration of the degree to which he was able to move with the times and partake of this new interest in classical mythology. Again, as I've mentioned already, the upper landscape in the upper left is much more dynamic, full of the forces of nature, sense of movement, highlights of the sun caught against dark, towering crags, feeling of movement in the trees and the clouds and what have you. This is really the work of Titian, and will provide a kind of interesting introduction um, to his ideas in painting. So the Feast of the Gods and the Sun Zachariah altarpiece give us a sense in these two pictures, a really clear sense of some emerging priorities in Venetian painting. Now, as I said already, the sense of a contrast with regard to the Florentine or Roman priorities as opposed to Venetian art is evident, I think, even in the work of Giovanni Bellini, who is a relatively conservative and again coming out of the 15th century, somebody schooled in the traditions of an almost a medieval approach to art, where we really begin to see a turning away from those Florentine modes of art is in the work of Giorgione and his successor Titian. And so we'll look at this first, the pastoral concert, or described in some places as the pastoral symphony. And there's still scholarly debate, although it tends to be resolved in favor of Titian, as to who is actually responsible for this work. But setting that aside for now, I think it's worth looking at the priorities of this particular painting as we are looking at a subject that is very, very difficult to nail down in terms of any narrative purpose, is entirely transported out into nature. There's only a hint, really, of the presence of civilization. There is the presence, a sort of strange juxtaposition, the presence of these two nude female figures with two clad male ones, which leads us to wonder exactly what's going on here. Their actions are by no means easy to determine. We see this individual here dressed in very fine clothes, strumming on a lute. This individual here much more simply dressed. We can see bare feet, perhaps being a shepherd. Again, the lack of attributes here in terms of clothing in the female nudes makes it difficult to understand really what purpose they serve. She holds a flute right here, and that probably is meant to be contrasted with the lute. The lute being a very complex and expensive and sophisticated instrument, the flute being associated with more pastoral modes of art making. By pastoral, I mean essentially art that's born of the country and that has this association with sheep and shepherds. It's a simple rustic kind of mode that's set in a place that is often described as Arcadia. Okay, Arcadia is a kind of never land out in nature where really shepherds just sit around and watch their sheep all day, play musical instruments. We can even see a bagpipe right here, and typically sing about love. And many interpretations of this painting hinge upon the idea of a kind of dialogue between what we might describe loosely as city, with these two characters right here, and country. Okay, so a more rural, rustic style house here associated with a shepherd, a more sophisticated architecture with this urban character here. And in that vein, perhaps it makes sense, therefore, that this figure turns toward what appears to be a cistern or tank of some kind with a crystal pitcher dipping into the waters, as it were, of inspiration. The key to take away from this is that, among other things, the subject matter is not very clear at all. That is to say, it's not intended to tell the viewer a specific story, but instead is intended to convey, again, an emotional state or mood of some kind. The forms are really suggested or implied rather than explicitly delineated, and so the painting creates form, in a very real sense, out of gradations of tone between lighter areas and darker areas. And it's also worth noting that it's painted on canvas, and so the rougher and more nubbly texture of canvas finds it's very, very effective in terms of depicting textures such as skin or implied sort of rough or nubbly textures of nature. So the pastoral concert is, I think, a very, very good indication of a revolution in art. And in many ways, this painting, it's worth pointing out, because it eventually finds a home in Paris, winds up being very, very influential for many hundreds of years after its creation in the beginning of the 16th century. As we'll see, moving into the 19th century, the artist Edouard Manet, for instance, very clearly draws upon this. Okay. When we look at the work of Giorgione, who's another successor really to Bellini, Giorgione da Castelfranco, and his painting entitled The Tempest, roughly contemporary again with the pastoral concert and the Feast of the Gods by Bellini, we see that predilection for ambiguity in terms of meaning and indeterminate narrative, the creation of a mood, the focus again on color to create the visual interest in a picture, as opposed to the disegno paradigm that's so typical of Florentine art. And the reason that is particularly applicable to this painting is that X-ray studies, in-depth kind of studies of the painting itself, have revealed that Giorgione was a very powerful artistic influence in the 16th century, particularly the first few decades of the 16th century. That Giorgione updated the painting as he went along, that there was not a clearly defined plan to which the artist confined himself to in the course of making the picture. So X-rays have shown, again, that some figures were added and others deleted, and the sense of the artist working it out as he went along is very, very strong. And in both the pastoral concert and in The Tempest, that sense of an improvised, ambiguous, emotionally driven picture finds a kind of summing up in the term poesia, P-O-E-S-I-A. That is to say, a work that is lyrical and poetical in nature, allusive. It seems to point to something else. It doesn't have a direct and clear narrative purpose in it. And The Tempest indeed has been the subject of numerous studies as people try to figure out, for instance, what is the relationship between these two figures, right? Why is this woman here mostly nude, suckling an infant? What's the significance of these broken columns right here? And of course, what is the significance of this lightning streak, the idea of painting a storm? It might be a reference to artists of the classical past that are described as being able to paint the impossible, like a lightning bolt, or does it have some other significance? So art historians have come up with all kinds of interpretations, historical, political, religious. The list literally goes on and on. The bibliography on this painting alone is really quite spectacular. So as we look at the two strands of Venetian painting coming out of the the early 16th century, the primary influences are going to be Giovanni Bellini and Giorgione. And I've already mentioned the young Titian, because that's the likely author for the pastoral concert. Let's look at that just one more time. When we look at the pastoral concert, it's very clear that that Titian has drawn some important lessons from the elusive and enigmatic and ambiguous mode in which Giorgione worked. Titian rapidly, though, rises to the top of the Venetian art scene, and this is helped along by the death of Giorgione in 1510 and the death of Giovanni Bellini in 1516. And a good example of the power which Titian was to bring to not just Venetian art but European art in general is seen in his Assumption of the Virgin, which was finished in 1518 and installed behind the high altar in one of the most important churches in Venice, Santa Maria Gloriosa dei Frari, a really, really important church indeed. And the altarpiece is on a spectacular scale. So instead of the small, intimate paintings the Tempest, for instance, is 2.5 feet square, roughly. And the Pastoral Concert is 3 by 4. These are clearly intended for private observation and viewing and contemplation. Titian shows that he's not just able to create small pieces in the Giorgionesque mode or large altarpieces in the Bellini-esque mode, but that he transcends essentially the limitations of the Sacra Conversazione by creating an altarpiece with a new sense of the dynamic. So there's a very strong feeling of motion, right? Lifting up through the gestures and hands and eyes, lines of sight and what have you of all the participants. The sense of motion, the sense of energy, of course, that dynamism elevated by the contrast of light and dark. We can see the ways in which flickering highlights, right, the infinitely subtle gradations between light and dark that are present really throughout the picture, culminating in this celestial vision above. The painting really caused a stir, and indeed continued, I think, to influence the nature of Italian painting and painting in general, as it ushered in a new sense of motion, energy, and emotional affect, propelled primarily by the quality of light. And it's worthwhile, I think, to compare this roughly to the achievements of Michelangelo in the Sistine Chapel ceiling, where Michelangelo's sculptural nudes focus primarily on a kind of three-dimensionality of solids, and light is not really given a whole lot of room to move. Here, Titian is not worried about kind of sculptural dynamics in terms of creating tension-filled forms the way that Michelangelo does, but instead wants to use those forms essentially as almost like models for the light to play upon, right, and to be clad in gorgeous saturated red garments and so forth. So in many ways, Titian and Michelangelo, I think, form the foundations of a style that we'll come to know as Baroque. That continues in his second spectacular altarpiece for the Church of the Frari, the Pesaro Madonna, where we see a composition dominated by strong diagonal and massive colossal architectural features, though the disposition of the figures is relatively static and what we might say a kind of Renaissance style. The focus again is on power, dynamism, a slightly off-center composition, focus on diagonals, all kinds of types of qualities that, again, as in the previous painting of the Assumption of the Virgin, point toward a different paradigm in art in general, not just painting. Titian also becomes not just known as a religious painter, but as a creator of mythologies, and people have described Titian as, in many ways, creating for readers of mythology the visual image of mythology. And a great example of that is going to be his meeting of Bacchus and Ariadne, dating from the early 1520s. And this is a painting that fit in with a series in the palace, essentially, of Alfonso d'Este, the Duke of Ferrara, who commissioned paintings from important artists of the time, pagans, with pagan subject matter, to decorate his palace. He ultimately really settles on Titian, and as we saw with Bellini's Feast of the Gods, pretty much allows Titian to dominate this series. So we get that first contribution from Bellini. He tried to get items from other contemporaries, including even Raphael, but it really is going to be the contributions of Titian that dominate the series, and indeed Titian's style becomes something to consider in its own right. To give you a sense of what I mean, if we consider the mythology, for instance, of Botticelli, a great example of a much more static and controlled mode of depiction, in this scene right here, which is taken from, again, a number of classical sources, Ovid, Catullus, what have you, describing the meeting of the great god of wine and just fecundity and fertility, encountering his wife-to-be Ariadne, who's been abandoned by Theseus. This is going way back in Greek mythology. We see him accompanied by an extraordinary crew of followers, right, satyrs and what have you, wielding all kinds of things, like, for instance, parts of livestock that they've torn apart in their Bacchic frenzy. We see this individual here wrapped up in snakes, a clear allusion to the famous Laocoon, the statue that actually has been unearthed in Rome in 1506. This little satyr right here is towing along the head of a calf. You see this dog barking at this, wondering what's going on here. These wonderful leopards right here pulling the chariot of Bacchus, probably taken from Alfonso's own private zoo. Again, the form of Bacchus leaping out of his chariot. This is actually very rare in Western art, to see somebody jumping like that in painting, unsupported by anything. Right? The sense of movement, of course, the fluttering drapery, the poetic aspect of it as these eyes meet right here is really quite remarkable. And it's clear to me that Titian is, again, trying to create this new visual language for mythology, and in a very real sense doing it in opposition or comparison with especially his great rival further south in Rome, and that, of course, is Michelangelo. So the meeting of Bacchus and Ariadne is really quite a wonderful, richly colored, extraordinary viewing experience. I've seen this actually in London, and the sense of these richly saturated blues, again, very, very scarlet, sort of crimson passages, orange. It's a real kind of a feast for the eye, and we are, more than anything else, I think, invited to kind of drink in that sense of rich color that really brings to life, I suppose, the poems and ideas and events and episodes of antiquity. A real kind of artistic humanism, I suppose. Lastly, we'll just look very briefly at Titian's work of 1538, his painting again on canvas, The Venus of Urbino, as this is a real watershed moment in the depiction of the female nude. It's going to become this real staple of Western art. Titian, in many ways, just like with mythology, sets out the parameters for painting this. He probably is developing to a certain degree on the work of his predecessor Giorgione, but Titian really goes to extraordinary lengths to create his own kind of style, I think, in handling the subject, and it particularly is relying upon the effect of canvas. There's this sort of tactile sense of texture that's created with paint, and that continues throughout the picture, especially if we look at the way in which he's handled, for instance, fabrics, hair. If we go in a little bit closer, we can begin to see the way in which the artist's brush is kind of intersecting with the texture of the canvas. And at the same time, right, we're seeing this idea of art and erotic sort of delectation coinciding. That is to say that this art clearly serves no uplifting moral message. People have really not been able to come up with, I think, a really good justification for this beyond a kind of erotic viewing experience. That art has that function, something that Titian really brings to the fore. And indeed, in a number of other, he paints many, many nudes, some more in the vein of classical mythology than others. But Titian really makes this particular subject, his own specialty, and finds many patrons interested in this subject. Okay, so to wrap up our discussion of Venetian painting, I just want to revisit a few important themes, and we'll just look primarily at the Bacchus and Ariadne really quickly. The focus on color is vitally important for understanding Venetian art. That is to say, the emphasis on richly saturated colors, focusing on the appeal to the senses rather than to the intellect, is very, very important. This sense in whether it's Giorgione's Tempest or whether it's the pastoral concert, but we'll just focus on the Tempest right now, of not worrying about clearly explicated narrative is certainly important. The concept of the poesia, I think, is important. Improvising as we go along is going to be a sort of central aspect of Venetian art. The lack of interest in accurate depiction of the human figure, as opposed to just simply creating an emotional climate, I think is important. The disegno versus colorido idea isn't only to do with color in terms of hue, but also in terms of which aspect of the viewing experience do we prioritize. Is it intellect, or is it the enjoyment of the senses? The Venetian legacy seems to push more in the realm of the senses, and I think that can be seen in again, most vividly probably in the pastoral concert, where a very light, in terms of historical significance or moral improvement, a very light-hearted or lightweight theme, the pastoral, takes on a new sense of depth, as it were, in the hands of Titian and Giorgione, and marks a very clear alternative to the Florentine and Roman paradigm.